Hello, I'm Tom Harper.
And I'm Diana Thomas.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
A podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
Then he looked northwards to the land mass that crouched like a great rock sphinx, dark and inscrutable upon the horizon. This was the Agulhas Cape, the southernmost tip of the African continent. Africa. The sound of that mysterious name on his own lips raised goose pimples along his arms and made the thick, dark hair prickle on the back of his neck. Africa. The uncharted land of dragons and other dreadful creatures, who ate the flesh of men, and of dark-skinned savages who also ate men's flesh and wore their bones as decoration. Africa, the land of gold and ivory and slaves and other treasures, all waiting for a man bold enough to seek them out and, perhaps, to perish in the endeavour. Hal felt daunted, yet fascinated by the sound and promise of that name, its menace and challenge.
That was a reading from Birds of Prey, which was the ninth book that Wilbur Smith wrote about the Courtney family, but it's actually chronologically the earliest volume in the saga. It's the first beginnings of the Courtney dynasty. It's a great swashbuckling novel set in the late 17th century, and it tells the tale of Sir Francis Courtney and his son Hal. They're the first of the Courtneys ever to set foot in Africa. Um, and it's set against the backdrop of what is now known, somewhat controversially, as the Dutch Golden Age. So, Tom, can you tell us a bit about that period?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to point out is that Wilbur is always quite vague about years. He doesn't like to be pinned down too much. So I think in the author's note of Birds of Prey, he talks about this being set in the mid 17th century. It's actually mid to late 17th century. Um, but it is set against the background of what's known as the Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch Golden Age is a flourishing of what's now the Netherlands. Um, you can argue about the dates, but I think the most commonly accepted start date is 1579, when the various states of Holland, of the Netherlands, formed the Union of Utrecht, which is basically a military alliance to fight against Spain, which has historically been the dominant power that runs the Netherlands. And it goes to around 1700. The date I liked for the end of it, is 1715, when the Dutch Republic can no longer pay its debts. It defaults on its debts, and that's really when it's over. So it's just over 130 odd years, covering most of the 17th century, when the Netherlands, undergoes this extraordinary expansion of trade, of wealth, of culture, obviously all the famous Dutch masters, and for a while is this tiny, very precarious country right on the edge of Europe, is one of the most powerful, significant nations in the world. So that's the Dutch Golden Age.
And I mean, as you said, we are still, I mean, this year there's a huge Vermeer exhibition in Holland, and this is also a time of Rembrandt and all the great Dutch landscape painters. But the question is, first, can we call it a golden age? The Amsterdam Museum has now taken the phrase golden age away from its permanent exhibition of what it now calls group portraits of the 17th century, because they say the term golden age ignores the many negative sides of the 17th century, such as poverty, war, forced labor, and human trafficking. And one of the things that is a major topic in Birds of Prey, and it runs right through it, and many of the characters, is slavery. And this was a time in which, among the things that made Holland rich, were slaves.
Yeah, and that's going to be controversial inevitably, as well as the other aspects you mentioned, like the fact that, by far from everyone in the Netherlands is living a golden existence through the 17th century. Um, I think there's two reasons that I personally am quite happy with the label the Golden Age. I think one is that the Dutch themselves used that term contemporaneously. So as early as 1644, you've got poets and writers talking about this is the dawn of a new golden age. This is our golden age. So it's actually a contemporaneous description, unlike, say, something like the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, which are later labels applied by historians. I do also think that, with all the caveats that you mentioned, this is an extraordinary period in Holland's history, the most extraordinary period in Holland's history. And if we're going to ever allow that any civilization ever has a golden age, then to me, that kind of combination of power, of wealth, of culture, I mean, these are the yardsticks of civilizations through history, whether they're right or not by our modern standards. That's how we judge civilizations. Um, yeah, it's extraordinary, and this is Holland's moment in the sun. And I think if that doesn't qualify as a golden age, then nothing in history ever would. So yeah, I'm happy with the label.
I mean, it's a bit like Athens in 500 BC.
Yeah, which also is a culture built on slavery, right?
Totally. But then on the other hand, you've got the Parthenon, you've got Plato, and you've got Socrates. So I mean, um, I mean, um, the other thing that's really interesting about this, and it again comes out in Birds of Prey, there's the looming presence all the time of the Dutch East India Company. And when the Dutch characters living on the Cape of Good Hope are being threatened by the power of authority, it's not a king or any aristocrats who threaten them. What they're frightened of is the 17, who are basically the board of directors of the Dutch East India Company. And it was kind of the first multinational company. I mean, it spread its tentacles, as it were, and its business all over the world.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary company and lots of firsts. So I think it's the first company to develop shareholdings, and actually develops them because they can't afford to pay the dividends that they promised to their subscribers. So they issue pieces of paper instead, which then start to be traded, which then become the shares. So it's an important company in lots of ways. I think what's interesting about the Dutch East India Company, which again, modern kind of observers of capitalism maybe won't be so surprised by, is that it actually starts as an attempt to be anti-competitive. So you've got various cities in Holland sending missions and voyages off to the East Indies to bring back the spices that they want. And because there are all these different expeditions going, there's more demand. So the locals in the East Indies put up their prices because there's more competition for buyers. It's a seller's market, and so the Dutch say, well, this is no good. There's no point of sending 17 different expeditions to then uh, barter, compete against each other and drive up prices. So they formed this East India Company basically so that the Dutch aren't outbidding themselves and driving up prices for the goods. So it's a fundamentally anti-competitive venture from the start.
So here we have this East India Company, and it's been set up, as you say, to essentially drive prices down in the East Indies by only having one buyer for all those. But what was it about Holland? As you say, it's a very small country, which basically is underwater the moment the pumps stop working, because it's all been most of the important economic areas of Holland have been reclaimed. So, how does this tiny little country, as opposed to the might of France at that time, or the might of Spain, and the beginning to grow power of Britain, what is it about Holland that makes it so successful, disproportionately successful?
I mean, that's kind of the 64 billion guilder question, isn't it? And I think historians, even, and again, fascinatingly, even at the time, English people would go to Holland, the Netherlands. They'd look around and they say, how on earth is this happening? This is extraordinary. And they would try to understand it. So again, contemporaries recognized that there was something almost kind of, this lightning in a bottle that's happening, and they struggled to understand it. Now, there's lots of potential explanations. I think I think the most plausible one for me is that it's just the pressure. So the Dutch Golden Age, they're basically at war for almost the whole thing. You have basically the 80 Years' War, and then that leads seamlessly into the 30 Years' War. And
It's 110 years altogether.
yeah, yeah. And you've got Anglo-Dutch wars, you've got Anglo-French wars. Holland is stuck between um, France, which is a massive continental power, later in this period under Louis XIV, who's obviously got big expansionist ideas. They've been governed by Spain, which is another major power, and just over the channel they've got England, Britain, which is
And the Habsburg Empire in Germany.
and the Habsburg Empire in Germany, indeed. So they are hemmed in on all sides, and they are fighting for their survival almost all the time, and that's what drives a lot of the political developments. Is that the Union of Utrecht is fundamentally a military alliance because it's a sort of self-defense treaty. And so I think that, as we see, in every century, including the 20th century, wars do spur innovation, and they spur a lot of um, developments that would take much longer in peacetime. I think the other thing is trade. Actually, the Netherlands in this period is sort of uniquely well positioned to capitalize on trade because there's, as you said, most of the country's underwater for a lot of the time. It's not a sort of fertile agricultural country, so they've always had to import an awful lot of their foodstuffs, and the way to do that is, for a country located where the Netherlands is by water, either on rivers with sort of intra-European continental trade, or by sea across the Baltic. So they've developed this very strong merchant marine, which then gives them the shipping capacity to move further and further into trade. Um, at a time when the previous sort of incumbent as the great colonial trade power, Portugal, is declining. And so they're able to grab an awful lot of the trade that Portugal previously had. And the next player, which obviously will take over from the Netherlands as the preeminent European trading power, Britain, hasn't quite got its act together. So lots of things kind of come together.
I think there's something else which is really interesting, which is Holland is a really good argument for free markets and free expression, because the free markets are explained by they're a kind of a bourgeois. They're not a society run by an aristocracy. They're a society that's run by a middle class, but also because they're Protestant and they're surrounded by Catholic countries, people have come to them from all over Europe, clever, ambitious people who could not survive in Catholic countries because they were themselves Protestant, or because their views, their philosophical views were. I mean, Rene Descartes is there, Spinoza is there. I mean, so incredible philosophy as well as Rembrandt and Vermeer. But you also have bright minds, scientists, technology is developing, clocks, all sorts of things, so that you really show the advantages of being open to people coming to your country who can bring you something, and then, as it were, giving them full reign, and your own people full reign to exploit their talents as best they can. It's a very advanced society in that respect, well ahead of the much more repressive countries all around it.
Yeah, and in fact, the Union of Utrecht, which sort of kickstarts the whole thing, it's interesting. It's a military alliance, but it also enshrines freedom of conscience. And as you say, that then attracts Huguenots from France as they get persecuted, Jews from all over Europe, and also Antwerp at the time has been the preeminent port in Europe, and that gets basically invaded by the Spanish. And so a lot of merchants and what we would nowadays call human capital moves from Antwerp to Amsterdam. And that, again, sows the seeds of a lot of the trade that then, centers on the Netherlands.
I mean, just to take us back to Wilbur, the Dutch have established by this point, they're the first people to colonize the Cape,
Yeah.
Cape Good Hope. And it's really just essentially it's a staging post for their ships as they head all the way out to the Far East. Because the other thing about the Dutch is that they're in Yokohama Bay. I mean, they are the only people, only Western people for, I think, the best at least 200 years between the mid 17th and the mid 19th century, whom the Japanese will allow to come into their territory, which really shows you the extent of their reach. And of course, a lot of the East Indies were Far East, were under Dutch control right up to the Second World War, and they have, of course, Caribbean colonies. So they've really gone a very long way. But just to sort of slightly change the subject, what interests me about the Cape of Good Hope, and they have been fairly horrible to the indigenous peoples, um, but the indigenous peoples are not, as we would now imagine, the population of South Africa as it is. They're the Hottentots, the San people, who are the kind of the original human beings. They are the closest people to to the original human Homo sapiens who would have crossed from East Africa into the Middle East and thence populated the whole world, and from whom we are all descended. And one of the things which I remember when I first read this is that, and one of the things I loved about Wilbur Smith, and I loved working with him, but also when I was just a fan, was that he tells you stuff that you didn't know, that his history is really fascinating, his ethnography is really fascinating, and that you get different perspectives reading his books into history than you would do, well, just by reading history books.
Yeah, and I think the way he dramatizes the sort of the settlement of Cape Town, which is, I think it's early 1650s that
Yeah.
Cape Town gets settled, and you've got the Courtneys there when they're captured by the Dutch, being used as manual labourers to build the castle, and it's kind
Yes.
of built with their sweat and blood, and that castle is still there today. So it's again one of these symbols that Wilbur uses to dramatize the history that's going on there.
Yeah, and of course, and the Dutch there are using Asian slaves from what we would now think as the Philippines and that part of the world, who they've brought over to be their housemaids, their coach drivers, and so this also shows that, as it were, the fact that there's multiple ethnicities involved in this.
Yeah,
That we have a picture purely of the kind of the West African trade from West Africa to the Americas, but of course it's a much more complicated thing.
yeah. There's a
And
great moment where I think it's Governor van der Velde is eating a samosa. And it's so incongruous to our modern sensibilities because they feel like Africa should be one thing and samosas belong in a different kind of mental space. But actually, I think what is being dramatized in this book, and I think throughout the Courtney series, is the way in which, in this period and then on, all these parts of the world that we think were off doing their own thing are tied together by these trading links, and particularly by companies like the Dutch East India Company, and of course by great seafarers like the Courtneys.
yeah, I mean, I think people underestimate the degree to which cultures and trade changed. I mean, go right across the world. I was researching the Vikings for reasons I can't now remember about it, and oh, I know, I was writing books about William the Conqueror, David Churchill, yes. But the Vikings, in Viking tombs, they've discovered, as were Chinese objects,
Mm.
because the Vikings went right through Russia and down to Constantinople, where they formed the so-called Varangian Guard in the very early Middle Ages. And then Constantinople was kind of at the end of the Silk Road. And so the kind of the lines that bind human beings together and different cultures together are much more ancient and much more widespread than people think. And you get in Birds of Prey, so how Courtney, the hero, falls in love with the captured and trafficked Sukina, who comes from Indonesia, who's now working as a sort of housemaid to the governor in the Cape of Good Hope. And his closest companion is Aboli, who's, and I suppose he's described as one of the people of the forest because, of course, in those days there simply weren't countries
Mm.
as we would now think of them. But I imagine him as being probably a Central African, what we would now think of as maybe Uganda or Rwanda, somewhere like that. So again, you have the interactions in the book of multiple um, different races, but each, I think, given kind of what you might call creative parity. that the Dutch characters, the Indonesian characters, the African characters, and the British characters are all written with the same energy and the same commitment, and they're not particularly, the fact that they belong to different cultures doesn't, if you like, affect the way that Wilbur writes them, or as that we would write them with Wilbur.
Yes, I think that's to Wilbur's kind of great credit as an author, but it's also actually, I think, reasonably historically true in that all the ideologies of racism that we're, depressingly familiar with today, I think don't really exist in this period. I think there's much more of a people are valued by their by their culture or by their civilization, or by their wealth, or by their power. But a sort of dogmatic racist ideology that just pigeonholes people literally by the color of their skin doesn't exist yet. And so I think things are more fluid.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I mean, I think the Courtneys are certainly portrayed as being very colorblind, as you might now say. But it's also true that, for example, within the colony, and indeed within some of the villains in the Earl of Cambrai and various other, there's a kind of automatic assumption that white people are superior to black or Asian people. But of course, this leads the white people who are stupid enough to believe that to greatly underestimate the people they're up against. So that says where the bad guys are seen to not profit at all from their racism, because they endlessly then get thwarted by the people they've underestimated. Like Sukina, for example, is endlessly is getting one over on her mistress or her master, and Aboli also is often underestimated and consequently is able to achieve things that people hadn't expected.
Yeah, and it's in a number of Wilbur's books, they are sort of cautionary tales. If you saunter around the world with this superior white privilege attitude, then you will come a cropper. And it's hugely satisfying for the reader, of course, when that happens. We love seeing
Yes,
these boorish racist characters, get their just desserts.
I think the other thing about Birds of Prey, which I hope is going to become a theme through these podcasts, as it certainly is in his books, is Wilbur's incredible capacity for describing um, the geography, the topography, the plants, and above all, the animals of Africa. I mean, as a reader coming to him, well, God, terrifyingly more than 35 years ago, um, immediately strikes you that when he's talking about what it's like to be close to an elephant, it's because he has in fact been close to an elephant. When he's describing the look in an eland's eye as it dies, because a hunter needs to kill it for food, you know that he's seen those dying animals, or you know that he's smelled the lion's carrion infested breath. And I think that's something which is so vivid in his work, and I'm sure it's something which people love about it.
Yeah, and in a sense, that was his great, I won't say unique selling point because his storytelling is second to none. So that, but definitely there are other great storytellers out there, but there was no one who was writing that authentically about Africa when Wilbur started doing it, I think.
Yes, it makes it terribly difficult for those of us those of us who are kind of working in his footsteps. It's very, very hard to match that. It's one of the challenges of being a co-writer. But anyway, back to the Dutch Golden Age, which we're supposed to be concentrating on. What do you think it was that this brief flowering happens and then it ends? Is it just the fact that, as it were, they're performing a kind of trick that can only survive for so long before they're simply crushed by superior powers? Because there are fewer Dutch people than there are Spanish or British or French people. Or was there something internal that made the whole thing collapse? I mean, what was it that as we're Holland, the Netherlands, reverted back to a kind of a scale that was more traditional?
Yeah, again, you can look at lots of different things. I think there is an element of just gravity asserting itself.
Yeah,
I think the whole project is built on this creative tension because you've got the different states of the Netherlands which have to combine. and work together. And it's like that classic creative tension, and in a sense, it's like the Beatles, where for a while that creative tension creates something amazing, but ultimately the tension sort of wins out over the creativity, and it sort of pulls itself apart. So I think there's definitely elements of that. It's hard to sustain that level of ambition and achievement when you're having to bring along lots of kind of disparate elements. So I think that's part of it. I mean, there is a financial reason that, of course, um, they borrow a lot of money. I think by the time, as I say, 715, when they default, they're spending more than half their national income on servicing their debts, and they never have huge armies. They have to borrow them. They can fund themselves. They have to borrow the money to pay for them. So in a sense, it's the Dutch golden age is kind of bought on tick, and eventually the bill comes due. But of course, the other thing is that other people see what they're doing, and they want some of it too. Most obviously, Britain.
And of course, Britain in those days has many advantages the Netherlands do, because it's also a seafaring country. It's open to the whole oceans. It's also a Protestant country which is getting in migrants, Huguenots and Jews, to quote some of the ones who went to Holland, and is very open. And it completely grasps the idea of the joint stock company, and just amps it up to the power of, because it fundamentally is a bigger country with more people, more resources. And uh, and the other thing I think which cripples Britain in the end is that when you go abroad and you start having colonies and you start having sea lanes and you start needing to protect those colonies and to protect those sea lanes, it becomes a very expensive business. And there's, I think, all empires. I mean, the Roman Empire is another example.
Yeah, I mean, there's a phrase from Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall. It's something like the Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of its own greatness, and it's that sort of thing, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, then I think that happens too. It took the British Empire rather longer to do it than the Dutch. But that said, I mean, they kept most of their possessions for say hundreds of years, and indeed still have. I mean, I don't know if Curacao and the other Caribbean islands are still part of Holland in the way that the French Caribbean islands are part of France, but they're still Dutch speaking. I think they're at Aruba. They're still Dutch speaking islands. So the influence of Holland still is felt all over the world, and of course they're still a fantastic trading nation.
I think the other thing that as Brits we have to bear in mind is that there's a way in which the Dutch kind of win even when they lose, because of course in 1688 William III of Holland it basically invades Britain and becomes king. So in the same way that I think someone once said that the ultimate vindication of Thatcherism was Tony Blair, in the same way the ultimate success of Holland of the Netherlands is actually that it sort of transplants itself into the UK. And traditionally, British histories show the Glorious Revolution of sort of 1688, 89 as a great spontaneous outpouring of Britishness against the kind of tyrannical tendencies of James II. But if you read the Dutch histories, it's very much they were worried about the British and the French forming an alliance against the Netherlands. So they put together their fleet and their army, and they go off to England and invade, and basically seize the crown for themselves, and therefore prevent Britain and France forming an alliance against them. And so the kind of Protestant, mercantilist, free trading country that emerges from that is very much, it's not just on the Dutch model, it's actually led by Dutch people, in opposition to the sort of Francophile, Catholic-looking James II. So, in the same way that sort of dinosaurs become birds, I think you can argue that maybe the Dutch Golden Age transmutes into the British Golden Age.
Yeah, it's funny. It's safe to say because certainly when I was being taught history, it was basically a long series of the British duffing people up,
Yeah.
all the way from kind of the Battle of Crecy through to the Battle of Britain. Like sort of 500 years of untrammeled, successful duffing up. But in fact, the Dutch were probably the last people who pretty comprehensively walked all over the British, which actually I think, and this is a silly thing to say, but one of the important things about Wilbur, although his characters, his main protagonists, often come from British families, the Courtneys, who run through the whole of the Wilbur saga, um, are Devonian. They come from Devon in the West Country originally.
Yeah.
Both they and he become African. I mean, he was an African. I think it's really important. I mean, he had a house in London. I first met him in a flat, I think in Marylebone somewhere. No, not Marylebone, Bayswater. Anyway, and he had a house in London to the day he died. Um, and so it's tempting because he writes about English characters to think he might, as it were, be British by outlook, and he would have had something of a British education in what was then Rhodesia, but fundamentally he's African. He's a white African, and I think that's such an important thing. And it goes back to what you were saying about the way he looks at the world. He does not look at the world through what you might call the guilty prism of British or American whiteness. He looks at it as one African writing about other Africans. And I think that's something which is going to come up again and again as we go through all his various books, because above all, he is the great storyteller of Africa, or at least of the white experience in Africa.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, I mean, as authors, I think, are both very much aware that how you introduce characters is so fundamental to the art of storytelling. And it's really interesting that Birds of Prey, which is chronologically the very earliest book in the Courtney series, um, although not written in that sequence. And it opens with the Courtneys sort of in media res. They're off the coast of Africa on their ship. They've been there for I think 65 days patrolling, and yeah, they are Devonian, but that's not important to their identity really. In this book, I think then in Monsoon he does give you a few dozen pages of them back home in Devon in High Weald, but then they leave never to return again, really. So, I mean, across Birds of Prey and Monsoon and Blue Horizon, which is his original prequel trilogy, as it were, of the Courtneys in this period, I mean, there's probably not more than 100 pages out of several thousand of them actually in Britain, because it's just not important to their identity. Africa is where they belong, and that's where we meet them.
So, insofar as Birds of Prey does have any specific historical date, it's the end of the Anglo-Dutch War in 1667. And the story revolves, to some extent, around Sir Francis Courtney, who's a sea captain, and he has what's called a letter of marque from the king, which is basically giving him the license to attack Dutch ships at sea, because at the time the letter of marque is issued, the Anglo-Dutch War is going on. But by the time the book begins, the war has ended, but it's ended kind of several thousand miles away from where our characters are. So, of course, the news hasn't reached them yet. And without the letter of marque, they become pirates. And I think the thing that's really interesting about this, apart from the fact that it's a rattling good yarn, is that you were talking about a time in which the kind of demarcations between trade and piracy, between being a soldier and being a gangster, are much less clearly drawn than they are now. And I mean, to what extent, Tom, do you think that as it were, you could almost say that all of colonialism was to some extent an act of piracy as well as an act of trade?
Yes, and I think you'd probably struggle to draw the line between those two things. I mean, it's interesting that it's a mid-century. I think the Dutch East India Company has something like 11,000 employees, and 8,000 of them are soldiers, because it's fundamentally a military operation. And I think we mentioned earlier that a lot of, and this goes to the British Empire as well, they don't start off as kind of you send in your army to conquer a place, you send in your merchants to trade with a place, and gradually they discover that they can get better terms and more merchandise and less hassle if they bring a few cannons to the negotiations, and then gradually sort of spread out from there. In a sense, that's how Britain later conquers India. So yeah, it's a very pure form of capitalism, really, where anything goes. The spirit of free enterprise is anything you can get away with. And I think Wilbur was always quite open about the fact that the Courtneys exist in this tradition too. Obviously, we generally see them on the side of right, but the fact that the sort of the family history goes back to the days of Sir Francis Drake. I think Francis Courtney is named after Francis Drake. And it's Drake who presents the great Neptune sword to the Courtney ancestors. Um,
Which I think is itself stolen, is it not, or taken as booty
Yes,
from
something like that. Yeah. So Wilbur's very much plugging them into that kind of intersection of where sort of piracy, trade, and naval power meet. And as you say, you said at the beginning, it's a matter of dates. So in June you're a loyal servant of the king, enacting your country's foreign policy, and by September, if you're doing the same thing, you're a pirate.
Indeed, and you get horribly tortured and hung, drawn, and quartered for it, because the wicked Earl of Cambrai has burned your letter of marque, and therefore you can't prove that you are acting legitimately as someone who goes around sinking Dutch ships, or rather capturing Dutch ships. And actually, that's an interesting thing, that they're much more interested in capturing a ship than they are in sinking it. In fact, they specifically don't want to sink ships because the ships are filled with all the plunder and the booty that they want to get for themselves. I mean, and indeed, and quite an interesting thing is that in the inventory of one of the first ship that Sir Francis Courtney takes, you kind of get a sense of what the Dutch are getting from their empire, because it's filled with spice, it's filled with gold, it's filled with rare woods from the East Indies. And of course, these are among the things which kind of fueled and funded this golden age. I mean, it's plunder is well. And again, where do you draw the line between things you've purchased and things you've plundered?
Yeah, I mean, by the time you've kind of raised, you've gone to some island of the East Indies, kind of raised the local population, local settlements to the ground, enslaved the population, and killed most of them.
I think that counts as plunder.
Yeah, yeah. Even though it's going to,
Call me a wokey, but I think that counts as plunder.
yeah. And of course, the other thing is that again, it's something historians debate a lot, particularly now. Is the Dutch Golden Age entirely built on slavery and plunder, or is it more than that? And economically, I think the statistics show that it sort of this kind of overseas trade never accounts for more than 10%, or maybe as little as 5% of the actual sort of economy. But it is, I think it's almost like the seed capital. And even early on, they raid the Portuguese commerce, because the Portuguese are taking gold out of West Africa. And it's that gold that they take which then allows them to build more ships, go further afield, and expand their trading networks. So it is kind of the seed capital that allows them to expand like that.
I think the other thing that you get in terms of the Dutch in Birds of Prey is the actual characters of the Dutch characters. There are three who are all very kind of classic Wilbur characters. The first one you meet is Katinka, who is this fabulously beautiful, blonde, busty, sex-crazed daughter of a high-up official in the East India Company who's been married to this enormous Jabba the Hutt, blubbery colonial governor called Van der Velde. And there you get, okay, let's just start with Katinka. Among the many ways in which Wilbur was not politically correct was his descriptions of of both male and female characters. He's unabashed in telling you just what makes them sexy. And down to the body parts and the sweats and the odors and the liquids. And let's not get into the detail on a polite podcast. He does write these very vivid female characters. And to do him justice, those female characters, as you were, have a female gaze on the male characters. So you see both things. You see how fabulously sexy she is to him, and also how wonderfully hunky he is to her.
Yeah, and in fact, it's really interesting that when I tell people that that I work with Wilbur, a lot of people spontaneously share their memories of what Wilbur means to them. And a lot of those people are women who remember, I read Wilbur as a teenager, and, that was kind of my making me weak at the knees. And that was, a sort of quite a sort of rite of passage for them. So, and even today, I think there's a huge female readership for Wilbur, which
Yeah, yeah.
even though you think of them and you look at the covers maybe and you think that these are stereotypical kind of men going off fighting sort of books, but actually, as you say, I mean, Katinka is a classic example, but they're examples all through the works of these incredibly strong female characters doing whatever it takes to get by, and really making a huge impression. Yeah, and Wilbur has a real gift for drawing those kinds of characters.
And I think the other thing is that I mean, they have a lot to them. So Katinka is I mean, she's a kind of a wicked witch type of character, and so she's a villainess, and so she's manipulative, and she entirely uses her sexuality to get what she wants, and then she meets a fantastically gory death when she's caught in the act, in bed with the executioner of Cape Town, Slow John. It's just and it literally down to the blood on the floor, and her husband and her relationship with her husband and her contempt for her husband, and Governor van der Velde, I think, represents the kind of ultimate Dutch burgher, kind of wallowing in all the money and the food and the kind of servants and everything that the quotes unquote golden age has provided.
Yeah, I think I'm interested. I don't actually know if Wilbur thought in these terms. If I think he probably just went for characters who fitted
Yeah.
the story and fitted his kind of purpose as an author. But you're right, Van der Velde does function, if you want to see him that way, as a kind of a stand-in kind of allegory for the excesses of the Dutch Golden Age, and this small country has gorged itself on the kind of the profits
Yes.
of the world, and become this very unattractive, political, manipulative character.
I mean, the third key Dutch character is Colonel Schroeder, who is a soldier, obviously, and is going to command the Dutch troops, who are actually mostly taken from various native populations, both African and Asian, on the Cape. And he's a fascinating character, and again a very Wilbur character, because on the one hand, he's obsessed with Katinka, and spoiler alert, it doesn't end well. Um, but so he's obsessed by her and driven by her, and also wildly jealous of Hal Courtney, who also has a thing for Katinka. But what's fascinating about him is, on the one hand, he's sort of a dandy in the sense that he dresses like a lot of soldiers do, very conscious to make himself look as fabulous as possible. He's very ruthless. He's very determined. He's very arrogant. He becomes very embittered. But at the same time, he has a kind of a code of honor. And interestingly, Hal Courtney, his great enemy, works by the same code. And one of the things that happens in the book is they kind of don't want to have the final battle between them until it can be sort of conducted in a sort of gentlemanly form, so that both their honor is satisfied. And again, that's a very that sense of masculine honor, masculine pride, and sort of pig-headed determination to have things their way. Again, that just runs right through Wilbur's male characters, for good and for ill, because the good guys are often the Courtneys, goodness knows, are pig-headed and amoral and proud of it, you know.
Yes, and I think that's actually why the women make some of the most memorable characters, because Wilbur isn't afraid of making the Courtneys occasionally quite not obtuse, because they're always kind of ahead of the game, but they definitely have moments where they're kind of acting first and thinking afterwards. Whereas a lot of the female characters, obviously, because they don't have that physical power, and society is constraining them in certain roles, they have to be much more thoughtful about how they go about things. And yeah, and you're right. Schroeder definitely is a sort of a foil to Hal, and I think that in Monsoon as well, you get the pirate. I think it's called Al Alf, and he again is. You start out thinking he's going to be the big villain, and actually, by the time they meet him, actually, there's almost a sorrow, a sadness when he dies, because he has been this worthy adversary and a
Yeah, yeah.
man of his own kind of ability and honor. So yeah, and that I think probably Wilbur understands that adds to the drama and the emotion of it all. That they're not just kind of two-dimensional ciphers who are there to be speared on the end of a sword. They're actually, they have these complexities of their own.
Yeah, I mean the baddies have good sides to their characters, and the goodies have plenty of bad sides to their characters. I think that just going back to Birds of Prey, I really do think in all sorts of ways it's a really archetypal, classic Wilbur Smith book, and actually because as you say, it begins the Courtney saga. It's as good a place as anywhere for anyone who's new to Wilbur Smith to start. You'll be riotously entertained from beginning to end. Somewhat offended if you have delicate 21st century sensibilities, but I think you'll find that the story is a kind of a guilty pleasure, if you do feel guilty about that sort of thing, that will keep you gripped all the way to the very end.
I've always held with the people who say there are no guilty pleasures, and
I agree.
I would. This is definitely not one to feel guilty about. I think this is just rip roaring pleasure from start to finish. It's interesting that Wilbur always said that people should read the books in the order he wrote them, and I think this is actually the eighth in that order. And I'm a very as a historian, I find the timeline is my god. So I definitely like to start from the earliest and move forward. So it'll be interesting actually to hear from people who've read them in different orders, and as to the different experiences you get reading them, starting here or starting with where the lion.
I thinking about it, I came to them because I was doing a lot of catching up. I think there's a sort of middle period in the 19th century, the sort of the late 19th century, very late 20th century ones set in South Africa. I think I more or less read those in consecutive order. But otherwise, now I was sort of dotting about all over the place. And perhaps one day we must sit down and we'll present, goodness knows, a month worth of podcasts on the full, complete, and utter history of the Courtney family from beginning to end. But in the meantime, we'll be back in the next episode with a look at A Falcon Flies, which introduces us for the first time to Wilbur's other great literary family, the Ballantines. So it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne.
Music by Dewey DeLay.